The sea never called to Bartholomew Roberts the way it did for most sailors. For him, there was no childhood dream of salt winds and distant shores, no craving for danger or rebellion. He took to the sea because it was a job, and jobs on land were hard to come by. Born in Wales, he grew up in a world of strict class systems and few opportunities. Roberts learned early on that to survive, you had to be obedient and competent. He became a sailor out of pure necessity, not romance. He was quiet, capable, and completely unremarkable in a profession filled with loud men chasing fortunes. By the time he found himself on a slave ship heading for the African coast, Roberts had already spent years at sea. He understood the rhythm of watches, the bite of discipline, and how quickly a single mistake could cost you your life. The ship's routines were brutal but familiar. The stench of human cargo, the constant creak of timbers, the endless calculations of wind and water. He was a navigator's mate, trusted with charts and measurements, respected for his precision, not his bravado. He didn't gamble, he didn't drink heavily, and he certainly didn't boast. Among sailors, this made him practically invisible, and invisibility was a form of safety. That illusion of safety shattered the day black flags appeared on the horizon. Pirate ships didn't bother with warning shots or formal signals. They came in fast, positioning themselves perfectly to cut off any chance of escape, their sails expertly trimmed for pursuit. By the time they were close enough to show their colors, the message was already crystal clear. Resistance would be met with brutal punishment. Surrender, on the other hand, might just let you live. The pirates boarded with practiced speed. There was shouting, the clash of steel, and the brief, blinding chaos as the merchant crew realized their fate had just been violently rewritten. Roberts didn't fight. He stood exactly where he was told, hands visible, eyes steady. He watched the pirate captain move through the captured men, assessing them not just for fear, but for usefulness. When the captain discovered Roberts was a skilled navigator, the decision was instant. Roberts wasn't asked to join them. He was told. This was the raw truth of how pirate crews really grew their ranks, not with grand speeches or promises of glory, but with force and opportunity. Skilled men were far too valuable to be wasted. Roberts was given a choice, but only in theory: join the pirates, or be abandoned on an unfamiliar coast with no supplies and no hope. He chose life. The transition was jarring and violent. One day, he was serving a merchant captain within a rigid hierarchy. The next, he was surrounded by men who answered to no flag and followed rules only when it suited them. Pirate ships were louder, dirtier, and far more unpredictable than anything Roberts had ever known. Here, authority came from reputation and threat, not a formal commission. Loyalty was a fluid concept, and violence was a common currency. At first, Roberts just kept his head down. He did his job. He charted courses, calculated bearings, and corrected errors. He spoke only when spoken to. But he was always watching, always observing. Pirates, for all their lawless reputation, were not fools. They noticed competence. They noticed a man who remained calm under pressure, who didn't panic when cannonballs started flying, or when sails ripped apart in a sudden squall. What truly unsettled Roberts, however, wasn't the lawlessness. It was the inefficiency. Decisions were constantly argued over. Discipline was applied inconsistently, if at all. Drunkenness regularly undermined the ship's readiness for action. For a man whose entire life had been shaped by order, this chaos was more than just irritating. It was dangerous. Pirates prided themselves on their freedom, but Roberts saw the steep cost of that freedom: missed opportunities, unnecessary risks, and wasted lives. Then, less than 6 weeks after being forced aboard, a dramatic event changed everything. The pirate captain was killed in battle. A broadside from an enemy ship roared, and smoke filled the deck. When it cleared, the ship's command structure was gone. On a pirate ship, a captain's death doesn't pause operations, it accelerates them. Leadership had to be resolved immediately, or the crew would fracture and turn on itself. The crew gathered on the deck. To Roberts' absolute astonishment, his own name was among them. He hadn't sought power. He had barely spoken a word beyond his duties. But in moments of crisis, pirates valued something more than bravado. They valued results. Roberts had guided them cleanly through treacherous waters. He had shown incredible nerve under fire. He hadn't stolen from his crewmates or cheated at cards. Without even trying, he had built a foundation of trust. When the vote was called, the outcome was clear. Bartholomew Roberts was elected the new captain. The transformation began instantly. He didn't promise them endless riches or eternal glory. he simply spoke plainly. If they chose him, he said, things were going to change. There would be rules, there would be order. Cowardice would not be tolerated, but neither would drunken incompetence. Plunder would be shared fairly among all. Punishments would be swift and consistent. The crew agreed, not because they had suddenly developed a love for discipline, but because they sensed a new kind of strength. Pirate crews were democratic, but their democracy always favored leaders who projected unshakable certainty. Roberts projected it without even trying. Within days, the entire feel of the ship was different. Watches were strictly enforced. Weapons were properly maintained. Quarrels were settled before they could escalate into bloody fights. Roberts himself began to dress better than the others, not extravagantly, but deliberately. He wore a clean coat and kept a trimmed appearance. He understood the power of symbolism. A captain who looked like he was in control inspired control in others, and something hardened inside him as well. The reluctant sailor, the man taken against his will, was gone forever. Roberts accepted what he had become, and once he did, he embraced it with a cold and calculating fury. He no longer thought in terms of escaping or begging for a pardon. He now thought purely in terms of gaining an advantage. Piracy, he realized, wasn't just chaos and anarchy, was a fierce competition. And in any competition, the winner is the one who plans better than their enemies. This single realization was the foundation on which his entire legend would be built. Before his ship, the Royal Fortune, would strike fear into the hearts of sailors across the globe. Before entire merchant fleets would scatter at the mere sight of his flags. Before naval officers would curse his name in frustrated reports sent across oceans, there was this moment. A quiet, capable man taken against his will, standing on a deck slick with smoke and splintered wood, making a choice not just to survive, but to command. The sea had never called to him, but now it belonged to him. Leadership on a pirate ship was a fragile thing. A captain ruled only as long as his crew believed he was useful, dangerous, and lucky. The vote that made Bartholomew Roberts a captain was decisive, but it was never permanent. Every order he gave, every course he set, every fight he chose, was judged in real time by men who had overthrown captains before and would do it again without a second thought. Roberts understood this in his bones. He didn't try to charm his crew or win them over with friendship. Instead, he moved fast to reshape how they saw themselves. His first change was purely psychological. Roberts talked constantly about reputation, not honor, but fear. He explained that a pirate ship didn't need to win every single battle if it could convince the world it always would. Fear, when cultivated properly, saved lives and multiplied profits. Think about it. A merchant captain who surrendered immediately kept his ship and cargo intact. A merchant captain who resisted invited destruction that helped no one. Roberts wanted surrender to feel like the only logical choice. To make that happen, he needed unity. Pirate crews were famously diverse, a mix of sailors from Britain, Ireland, Africa, the Caribbean, sometimes even former soldiers or escaped slaves. What held them together wasn't loyalty to a king or a country, but shared risk. Roberts made that bond official with a strict code of articles. These rules were read aloud and agreed upon by everyone. Shares of the loot were clearly defined. Injuries were compensated. Stealing from a fellow crew member was punished far more harshly than stealing from their victims. Even gambling disputes were settled by the rules, not with a blade. This wasn't about being merciful. It was about being efficient. Discipline transformed the ship. Men slept when they were told. Weapons were cleaned every day. Gunpowder was protected from moisture with an almost obsessive level of care. Roberts drilled the crew relentlessly, teaching them to be silent during their approach and brutally violent during the boarding. The contrast was intentional. Quiet, deadly competence right up until the moment of attack, then a storm of overwhelming force. His own appearance reinforced this image. Roberts dressed far better than any pirate had a right to. He wore fine coats, bright sashes, even jewelry taken from his prizes, but it was always worn with a purpose. He wanted to look like command made flesh. When merchant crews saw him step onto their deck, they were meant to feel that any thought of resistance was completely pointless, and success came quickly. Ships fell with barely a fight. Flags were lowered, holds were opened, cargo was transferred with ruthless cold order. The captured crews were questioned, then released or marooned depending on how useful they were or what their attitude was like. Roberts didn't enjoy cruelty for its own sake, but he wasn't afraid to make an example of someone. A few public punishments, carried by rumor across the sea, did the work of a dozen cannons. as the victories piled up, something else began to change. The men who joined Roberts' crew no longer saw themselves as desperate outlaws. They saw themselves as part of something bigger, floating power that moved faster than the law and struck harder than anyone expected. Confidence replaced their fear. Loyalty replaced their doubt. With each capture, Roberts became more than just a captain. He became an institution. It was during this time that he started to think differently about ships. Most pirates just took whatever they could get and sailed it until the hull rotted or the crew mutinied. Roberts thought in terms of upgrades. He wanted speed without sacrificing firepower, intimidation without being vulnerable. Whenever a better ship presented itself, he took it, transferred his crew, and abandoned the old one without a shred of sentiment. And when he finally captured a vessel worthy of his ambition, he gave it a name that was neither ironic nor playful. He called it the Royal Fortune. The name was a calculated statement. Royal mocked the kings and navies that hunted him. Fortune acknowledged the high-stakes gamble of piracy itself. Together, they suggested inevitability as if wealth and victory were his by right. The crew understood the message immediately. This wasn't a temporary command. This was a reign. Under Roberts, the Royal Fortune became more than a ship. It became a moving court of law, an economy, and an engine of terror. Orders were obeyed not because they were shouted, but because they were expected. The crew started enforcing discipline among themselves. Roberts no longer needed to threaten his men to prevent a mutiny. His incredible success had already done that work for him. But of course, power attracts attention. Merchants began to speak his name in whispers. Governors wrote panicked letters back to Europe. Naval officers started to recognize patterns in his attacks, the routes he favored, the ports he avoided, a timing that was far too precise to be mere luck. Roberts wasn't just roaming aimlessly. He was hunting with a plan. As his reach expanded from the Caribbean all the way across the Atlantic, his confidence grew sharper, colder. He flew flags that offered a choice, death or mercy, depending on whether you surrendered. He timed his attacks to hit convoys at their weakest points. He used smaller vessels as scouts and decoys, coordinating his strikes with an efficiency that was almost military-grade. Some pirates hated this structure. A few left his crew. Others decided to test his authority, and they paid for it, publicly. Roberts didn't negotiate with insubordination. He understood that showing mercy to a challenger would weaken his command more than any act of violence ever could. Still, he wasn't reckless. He avoided powerful Navy warships whenever possible. He only picked fights that he knew would pay off. He withdrew when the odds turned against him. But his reputation was so fearsome that retreat was rarely necessary. This perfect balanced daring, without being foolish, was the secret to his rise. Other pirate captains burned bright and then vanished. Roberts endured. Every successful cruise reinforced the belief that he was protected by skill as much as by luck. The name Royal Fortune began to carry weight before the ship itself was even seen. A rumor of her presence in the area could empty an entire harbor. A report of Roberts' flag on the horizon would send merchants scrambling for naval escorts that almost never arrived in time. The sea, it seems, responds to confidence, and Roberts radiated it. By the end of this period, the man who had once been forced into the life of a pirate had completely reshaped it around himself. He had proven that piracy could be more than just chaos. He showed it could be systematic, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. His crew no longer voted for him out of fear or hunger. They followed him out of belief. And belief, once it's anchored to success, is a lot harder to sink than any ship. The ship that would become the Royal Fortune didn't start its life as a legend. Like most vessels that fueled the age of piracy, it was built for profit, not fear. It was sturdy, fast enough, and well armed for defense, but certainly not for dominance. What transformed this vessel wasn't its timber or its canvas, but the intent of one man, Bartholomew Roberts. Roberts understood a fundamental truth. A ship is an extension of its captain's command. If the crew was his body, the ship was his skin. It had to project overwhelming strength before a single cannonball was ever fired. The moment Roberts took the vessel, his first act was to strip it of its former identity. The old nameboards were torn away. The merchant flags were burned. The past was erased with a cold, ritualistic precision. Then, the new name was painted boldly, where all could see it. Royal Fortune. It wasn't hastily scrawled. It was clean, deliberate, and unmistakable. And that name, that idea, would travel far faster than the ship ever could. Royal Fortune was immediately refitted with a singular, brutal purpose: to overwhelm quickly and decisively. Guns were repositioned for faster, more devastating broadsides. The powder stores were reorganized for speed and safety. The hull was lightened wherever possible, sacrificing the crew's comfort for precious maneuverability. Roberts' strategy was to close the distance fast, presenting an unavoidable threat that forced surrender before a real battle even began. He also reorganized the crew, building them around the ship itself. Gun crews drilled relentlessly until they could work blind in the thick, choking smoke of battle. Boarding parties were assigned specific roles and rehearsed their movements like actors in a deadly play. No longer did men rush blindly over the rails into chaos. Every action now had a sequence, a timing, a command. Sheer chaotic violence was replaced with a deadly choreography. This profound change altered how the crew saw themselves. They were no longer just scavengers hoping to overpower weaker prey. They became operators of a finely tuned machine. Each successful capture reinforced the idea that the Royal Fortune wasn't just lucky, it was engineered to win. Roberts was also a master of symbolism. He designed and flew flags meant to inspire pure terror, skeletal figures raising weapons, hourglasses mocking the very concept of time. But he didn't fly them constantly. Sometimes he'd approach a target under neutral colors, letting a chilling uncertainty do his work for him. Then, when the pirate colors finally rose, the delay made their appearance feel inevitable, like a final judgment arriving late, but absolute. The effect was astonishing. Merchant crews began surrendering without a fight. Ships were taken intact. Cargo was seized with clean efficiency. Roberts actively encouraged this pattern because it multiplied his success without increasing his risk. Every clean capture added to Royal Fortune's growing reputation, and that reputation made the next encounter even easier. The ship became faster not just through wind and sail, but through rumor. As Roberts' confidence in his ship grew, so did his ambition. He pushed his operations far beyond the predictable shipping lanes. He ghosted between the Caribbean and the coast of Africa, striking where naval defenses were thin and response times were slow. He captured ships not just for their cargo, but for the information they carried, learning convoy schedules, naval patrol patterns, and the political priorities of his enemies. This intelligence fed directly back into the ship's operations. The Royal Fortune didn't just wander the seas. It appeared with calculated precision. The crew felt the difference. The risks felt smaller. Men who had initially chafed under Roberts' rules now enforced them because they understood that this structure was the very reason they were still alive and getting rich. Roberts himself changed alongside his ship. He dressed in increasingly lavish clothes, not out of vanity, but as a form of theater. A pirate captain who looked like a king was far more unsettling to his opponents than one who looked desperate. He wanted fear to precede him into every negotiation. And in Roberts' world, negotiation was just another word for surrender without bloodshed. The name Royal Fortune became a fixed star in the pirate world. Other captains measured themselves against it. Some sought an alliance with him. Most simply avoided his hunting grounds entirely. The few who dared to challenge him simply disappeared from the record soon after. But success carries its own weight. Every victory narrowed Roberts' margin for error. Colonial authorities could tolerate scattered, opportunistic piracy. They could not, and would not, tolerate a system. Roberts represented something far more dangerous than simple theft. He represented control. Governors began to coordinate their efforts. Naval captains received clearer mandates to hunt him down. The bounties on his head skyrocketed. The information networks of the establishment began to tighten. The sea itself didn't change, but the response to Roberts certainly did. And so, the Royal Fortune adapted. Roberts altered his routes more frequently. He drastically reduced his time in port. He rotated his crews between different vessels in his fleet to prevent complacency. And when one of his ships grew sluggish or took too much damage, he replaced it without hesitation, simply transferring the name Royal Fortune to the newer, better hull. To the world, the Royal Fortune was a single, terrifying ship. In reality, it was an evolving platform, always being optimized. This fluid identity completely confused his pursuers. Official reports conflicted. The ship's tonnage varied. Its armament changed, but the name stayed constant, and that was enough to keep the fear alive. Roberts even used mercy as a strategic weapon. He would often release prisoners, knowing they had stories to tell, stories of his unwavering discipline, his calm authority, and the inevitability of defeat when facing him. These men became his unwilling heralds, spreading the legend of the Royal Fortune far wider than any flag ever could. Still, Cracks began to show at the edges of the floating empire he was building. Success bred confidence, and confidence bred immense risk. The Royal Fortune's dominance encouraged Roberts to operate closer and closer to heavily trafficked routes, where the rewards were richest, but the naval response was fastest. He knew the danger, but he believed his speed and meticulous planning would always compensate. After all, the ship had not failed him yet. By this point, the Royal Fortune moved like a living thing, adjusting to pressure, responding to threats, and exploiting the slightest hesitation from its prey. It was not the largest pirate ship to ever sail, nor the most heavily armed, but it was without a doubt one of the most efficient. And in a world where a few seconds could decide the outcome of an engagement, efficiency was power. Bartholomew Roberts was no longer just reacting to the sea. Trade routes literally bent around his presence. Naval escorts were reassigned. The ripple effects of the Royal Fortune's movements were felt across entire oceans. What had begun as a forced choice aboard a captured slave ship had grown into a floating state, ruled by a man who understood that true authority wasn't loud, it was consistent. The Royal Fortune no longer needed to announce itself. The sea already knew its name, and so did those who were preparing, quietly and patiently, to destroy it. Bartholomew Roberts and his ship, the Royal Fortune, were masters of a dangerous paradox. To be feared, he had to be seen, but to survive, he had to disappear. Roberts walked this tightrope with incredible skill, tightening his grip as the world's navies closed in. The golden age of easy pickings was over. Merchant captains were no longer sailing blind. Naval patrols hunted with purpose. Spies watched every harbor, looking for that familiar silhouette, that distinctive set of sails. The game had shifted from simple raids to a deadly, sustained pursuit. Roberts's answer was to double down on what always made him different: discipline. Under his command, piracy became a science. Every man knew his exact role, not just in battle, but in escape. He drilled them relentlessly in silence. At night, every lantern was shielded. Every sail was adjusted with a precision that bordered on religious. The Royal Fortune could change course in an instant, slip through the blackness, and vanish where heavier warships couldn't possibly follow. Fear wasn't just about the terror he inspired in his victims. It was about the confusion he sowed in his enemies. Naval officers chased ghosts, always one step behind, always guessing which Royal Fortune they were even hunting. Roberts fueled this confusion on purpose. Whenever he captured a better vessel and renamed it Royal Fortune, he made sure any survivors carried conflicting stories back to port. Different numbers of cannons, different sizes, different rigging. The name stayed the same, but the ship was a phantom, constantly changing form. This brilliant strategy bought him time, but it couldn't buy him safety. As the British and French navies started working together, they stopped chasing rumors and started closing the gaps in their net. Merchant convoys sailed with heavier protection. Naval escorts lingered longer, and the massive bounties on Roberts's head drew independent pirate hunters into the chase. Suddenly, Black Bart wasn't the only predator in the water. Aboard the Royal Fortune, the discipline became ironclad. Drinking was strictly controlled. Fights were punished immediately and harshly. Roberts knew that a crack from within was far more dangerous than any enemy cannon. A distracted crew missed signals. A resentful crew hesitated. He ruled with cold, predictable consistency, not warmth, and the men respected it because that consistency kept them alive. Still, the pressure was immense, and cracks began to show. Some of the crew started whispering. This wasn't what they signed up for. Early piracy promised a quick fortune and a quiet retirement. Roberts heard the murmurs, but he never acknowledged them. To admit doubt was to give it power. Instead, he led from the front, projecting absolute certainty. Even as the seas grew more hostile, he became more defiant, almost reckless. He attacked convoys while they were under naval escort. He captured ships in plain sight of coastal forts. These were calculated risks, designed to feed the myth that he was invincible. Fear, he believed, was still his greatest weapon. And for a while, he was right. But the empires that had once tolerated pirates were now losing too much money. Trade was being strangled. Insurance rates were skyrocketing. He was to be destroyed. The change was immediate. The pursuit became relentless. Warships no longer gave up the chase after losing sight of him. They started anticipating his routes. They coordinated their patrols. They were learning. Roberts was still faster, still smarter, but the gap was closing. He had to change tactics again, favoring surprise over spectacle. He avoided long fights. He rarely flew his infamous black flag. Invisibility now mattered more than fear. The crew felt the change. The mood on the Royal Fortune grew quiet and sharp. The jokes stopped. The long night watches felt even longer. Every prize they took was tainted with the question, how long could their luck possibly hold? Through it all, Roberts remained the picture of composure. He still dressed in his fine red silks. He still gave his orders with unnerving calm. But those closest to him saw the signs. He paced the deck more at night, staring at his charts, tracing routes that offered fewer and fewer escapes. The world was shrinking around him. His final ship, also named Royal Fortune, was his largest and most powerful yet. It was a decision born of both ambition and desperation. Roberts knew he was being hunted down. He chose strength over speed, believing that if a final battle was inevitable, he would meet it on his own terms. It was a fatal miscalculation. The new Royal Fortune carried more guns, more men, and more confidence. But it was also heavier, more visible, and had far fewer paths to escape. He put his faith in the power of fear. He put his faith in himself. But the naval commanders trusted something else: inevitability. They had studied his habits. They positioned their ships not to chase him, but to intercept him. When reports of Royal Fortune's location came in, they no longer reacted, they anticipated. Roberts sensed the trap too late. By the time he sailed into those waters, the net was already tight. But there was no retreat. Retreat would shatter the legend. Retreat would invite mutiny. As always, Roberts chose to move forward. The crew prepared for battle with mechanical precision. Guns were run out. Powder was readied. The colors were raised. This wasn't a desperate scramble. It was a ritual, the final act of a system that had worked for far too long. Fear still hung heavy in the air, but it had finally changed direction. The Royal Fortune was no longer just a symbol of terror for merchants. It was now a target, a challenge the world's navies had to answer. And at the center of it all stood Bartholomew Roberts, dressed in his finest, a figure of calm in the rising storm. The sea doesn't care about reputation. Cannons don't hesitate for legends. Roberts had built his empire on understanding this truth. Now, he would face the final test, to see if discipline and belief could withstand the full weight of a world that had finally decided to end him. And the sea, patient as ever, waited to claim its own. The end didn't come with a thunderclap. There was no grand announcement, no moment where the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. It arrived the way most endings do, quietly, decisively, and with no respect for legends. The Royal Fortune was cruising off the coast of West Africa when the British warship finally closed in. Its captain, Bartholomew Roberts, had been preparing for this kind of battle for months, maybe even years, but no amount of preparation can truly soften the shock of surprise. The enemy approached under a deceptive calm, their sails trimmed just enough to look harmless, right up until the distance between them collapsed into inevitability. By the time the threat was undeniable, it was too late to run. Roberts didn't hesitate. He dressed for battle as he always did: a fine coat, a crimson waistcoat, and a hat adorned with a plume. Gold chains rested across his chest, not as simple vanity, but as an armor of identity. He wanted his crew to see him exactly as he had always been: composed, commanding, and completely unafraid. In moments like these, leadership is as much visual as it is verbal. His orders were given calmly. The cannons were run out. Powder boys moved with practiced efficiency. No hint of panic. The Royal Fortune turned to present her broadside, a final, defiant assertion of dominance, not a plea for mercy. Even then, Roberts believed that fear could still tip the scales in his favor. The first volley shattered that belief. A single burst of grapeshot tore through the air, and a piece of it struck Roberts almost immediately, ripping through his throat before a single word could escape his lips. Death was instantaneous. There was no dramatic fall to the deck, no final shouted command. The man who had bent the sea to his will simply collapsed without ceremony, killed before the battle had even truly begun. The effect on his crew was catastrophic. Roberts had been more than their captain. He was the very axis around which their discipline, their fear, and their confidence all rotated. His death didn't just remove their leader, erased their certainty. In mere seconds, the incredible machine he had built began to fracture. Orders faltered. Coordination slipped away. The tense silence that once preceded their violent, precise attacks turned into outright confusion. The Royal Fortune fought on, but the spirit was gone. Without Robert's presence to anchor them, the crew reverted to what piracy always threatens to become under pressure: a group of individuals reacting to chaos, rather than a single system acting with purpose. Cannon fire continued to rain down on them. Their resistance became symbolic, rather than strategic. The British pressed their advantage relentlessly. They didn't offer terms. They didn't slow their assault. This wasn't a negotiation. It was the execution of a policy. The royal fortune was battered into submission. Her power stripped away piece by piece, her fearsome reputation unable to deflect the cold iron and disciplined fire of an equal force. When the fighting finally ended, an entire era ended with it. The survivors were captured, put on trial, and many were executed. The royal fortune was stripped of its meaning, reduced to just another vessel once the name and the man were gone. There was no succession, no one to continue his work. What Bartholomew Roberts had built was so inseparable from himself that without him, it simply could not survive. News of his death traveled quickly. Merchants celebrated quietly in their offices. Colonial governors wrote triumphant letters back to London. Naval officers eagerly took the credit. But among the pirates, the reaction was different. A heavier feeling settled in. Roberts' death wasn't just the loss of a powerful captain. It was proof that the very model he represented had reached its absolute limit. Piracy had always thrived in chaos, but Roberts had imposed order on that chaos. That order made him extraordinarily successful, but it also made him visible. He couldn't just fade into obscurity, because his system required consistency. His greatest strength had ultimately become his fatal weakness. In the months that followed, piracy declined sharply across the Atlantic. It wasn't because the sea suddenly became safer, but because the fundamental calculation had changed. The risks now clearly outweighed the rewards. The fate of the royal fortune loomed large in every pirate haven. It proved that no matter how disciplined, how feared, or how efficient you were, the end was always the same. And yet, a legacy isn't erased by defeat. Roberts' methods echoed long after his death. Naval forces studied his tactics. Other pirate captains tried and almost always failed to replicate his strict discipline. The idea that piracy could be an organized, strategic, and sustainable enterprise had been proven, even if it was only for a brief, shining moment. The royal fortune lived on in memory as more than just a ship. It became shorthand for a moment in time when piracy reached its absolute apex, not in its brutality, but in its precision. It represented the point where an outlaw enterprise could genuinely rival the power of a state, forcing the entire world to respond. Roberts himself became something stranger than a legend. He became a cautionary figure. He wasn't reckless or needlessly cruel. He was relentless. He was a man who understood systems so well that he could never truly escape them. He didn't die because he was foolish. He died because he stayed consistent in a world that had finally adapted to him. There was no final speech, no dramatic last stand worthy of a myth, and perhaps that's fitting. Roberts had always believed that results mattered more than spectacle. His life ended exactly as it was, lived efficiently, abruptly, and without a trace of indulgence. The sea reclaimed the royal fortune as it reclaims all things. Its wood rotted, its iron rusted. Names faded from hulls and logbooks alike, but the ripple of his reign lingered. It could be seen in shipping routes, in naval doctrine, and in the quiet knowledge that for a brief span of years, one man and one ship had forced empires to change their course. That was the true measure of his power. Not the gold he took, not the ships he captured, but the simple fact that the world had to change because of him. And once it had changed, there was no place left for the royal fortune to sail.